When Susan Snow was just 17, her father, a Los Angeles police detective, was murdered in the line of duty. That tragedy shattered her world and set her on a decades-long journey through trauma, silence, and eventually, healing. Today, Susan is an author, speaker, and trauma survivor who helps others find light on the other side of pain. In this episode, we talk about the moment everything changed, the slow work of forgiveness, and what it means to live with courage after unthinkable loss. This is Stories from Real Life with Melvin E. Edwards, and today's story is Susan Snow's The Other Side of the Gun.
And I felt like that message was so important to not only just law enforcement, but anyone who has gone through anything traumatic in their life, and to let them know that they're not alone, because that's what you feel when you've gone through a trauma, is you feel like you're the only one. You're like lone person on an island. Nobody knows how you feel. But I want people to know that they're not alone. And it doesn't matter what kind of trauma. It really doesn't, because everybody experiences trauma differently. They deal with it differently.
You are listening to Stories from Real Life, a podcast by engaging storytellers for engaged story listeners. Here's your host, author and journalist, Melvin E. Edwards.
Hello again, and welcome to another episode of Stories from Real Life. I'm your host, Melvin E. Edwards. Thank you for joining me for the podcast where personal stories can have a global impact. My guest today is Susan Snow, who will share her tragic story, but she'll also remind us that even your pain can become your purpose. Susan Snow, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you for being here. So you were 17 years old. It was Halloween when your father, Thomas C. Williams, a Los Angeles police detective, was murdered in the line of duty. How did that moment and the immediate aftermath shape your identity and your worldview?
Gosh, well, there was a lot going on. I think for me, I had a normal teenage life before that happened. And I grew up with a cop father, and I went through all the things that young people go through with their parents being in law enforcement, hearing some negative talk about police officers and things like that. My dad was a detective when I was around 5th or 6th grade, and I was actually right by his precinct. So whenever I had a dentist appointment or a doctor's appointment, it was always him that picked me up and took me. And that's, the kids would create stories about that. And I was always like, I got busted. The cops came and got me because it was a narc car, and all those things that you go through as a kid. And also I had a false sense of security with him being a detective. I figured he came in after the fact, and he, I figured he was just a detective and that he came in after the fact. He wasn't in imminent danger. It was, that kind of thing. And I just, never thought that anything bad would ever happen to him because of that. So I just did what I just had that false sense of security.
So at that young age, how much did you understand about trauma, grief, and loss? And how did you attempt to cope before you realized you needed some help?
Gosh, well, I didn't know what help was, to be honest. This was the mid 80s when my dad was killed, and there was really no talk about mental health back then. And there were no resources for kids, especially with LAPD. They had systems in place to support the widows and the widowers, but not really a whole lot with kids. And so for me, struggling with the fact that I was going through all of this and really didn't have a support system behind me, dealing with grief and trauma and all of that. So it was just, immediate fight or flight, basically, from the beginning.
What was a pivotal moment when you realized, I need help beyond what I'm doing on my own? Was there a specific trigger or event that led you to seek trauma-specific support?
Yeah, actually, my gosh, well, it was many years later. I lived in fight or flight, freeze and fawn for 14 years of my life. Initially, I had therapy at 17, and it was voluntold that I was going to go. At the time, I just thought, if you go to a therapist, you're nuts. I mean, that was my kid brain. And unfortunately, that gentleman that I went and saw he was not trauma informed, nor was he trauma competent. And he did not want to dip his toes in the weeds with me. So I didn't feel comfortable. I didn't feel safe with him as far as being able to be vulnerable. I didn't know how to verbalize everything that was going on with me. And it was everything that PTSD brings you, which is anxiety and depression, suicidal ideation, all of it. And every week when I saw him, he kept our sessions very, very normal. It was just more talk therapy. And it was more about my relationship with my mom, my brother, my boyfriend at the time, and school, because I was a senior in high school at the time. And every week I went to him thinking, oh, today's the day. He's going to say something. He's going to do something that's going to make me feel better. And that didn't happen for an entire year.
Wow.
I saw him on the last day and he said, Susan, you're a well-rounded young lady and you're going to be fine for the rest of your life. And I don't need to see you anymore. And so I literally walked out of his office thinking, okay, I've snapped. I'm out of control. I'm crazy. Not even a professional can help me. And I'm going to have to figure this out on my own. And that was unfortunate because what I ended up doing is I created an emotional mask based on what people told me I was. So when I heard people say, oh, Susan, you're so brave. Susan, you're so strong. That's what I hid behind. So nobody on the outside could see all the turmoil that was going on inside. They saw the strong Susan and the brave Susan. And that's how I lived my life. Not to mention the fact that because of that, I was not able to recognize when relationships were not healthy. I molded myself to be who people needed me to be. And I was a huge people pleaser, huge. So I never advocated for myself. I never said, this doesn't feel right to me. I'm not ready for this, none of that. And so, I got married to the boyfriend that was with me from the very beginning. And both of us were young. We were very young. And I was 21, he was 24, and neither of us were ready for marriage because we were expected to get married because we had been together for many years prior to. So it was an expectation that we both felt, I think. We both loved each other immensely, don't get me wrong, but I just don't think that emotionally we were equipped to be married. We had both gone through this trauma together, right? So both of us were unhealed trauma survivors. And we got married, we had 2 kids, And I got to the point where I wanted to leave Southern California. I figured if I left it all behind, then I could start anew in another state and no one would know who I was. No one would know my story. Ha ha ha. Look where I am now.
Yeah, look where you are right now.
And that, geographically, if I just left it behind, it would just stay where it was at, right? And it wouldn't come with me. And that was the lie that I told myself. We moved in 97. We decided to move to Colorado. And I was working as a hairdresser at the time. And I worked in a salon that was very close to Littleton, Colorado. And I was working on April 20th of 1999.
I know where this is going.
Yep. I had done a client's hair, put her under the dryer, went into the back room and turned on the TV, and up popped the live coverage of the Columbine shootings. And I had a visceral reaction. I had flashbacks of the night my dad was killed. I saw the police cars, the ambulances, the kids around my own age, the school, and it all came flooding back to me of the night that I saw my dad's body. At that point, I started to have a panic attack. I turned white as a ghost. And my colleague that was standing next to me, she had no idea what was going on. And remember, I was told I was going to be fine for the rest of my life. So I didn't recognize what was going on either. And so my colleague left the room and I did what I always did. I put that emotional mask back on. And I kept telling myself, this has nothing to do with me. So I'm going to feel better tomorrow. Like, I'm just going to go ahead and finish my day and this isn't going to bother me. And I walked out of the room stoic. And everybody around me was emotional. There were tears and anger and all kinds of emotions going on around me, but I was steadfast in being stoic. And I finished my day and I walked out the door, and everything I dealt with when I was 17 years old came flooding back at me. And this time it was worse. I stopped sleeping, which happened to me in the very beginning, and I started to go down the spiral of depression into a very dark place. And this time I really struggled. I had an inner struggle because I didn't want to feel like this anymore. But then I had 2 babies at home that needed their mom. And as scared as I was, everything I could was to stay alive. And my husband, being the smart man he is, recognized it. And he met me at the door one day and he said, you have 2 choices. You either go get help today or I'm putting you in a hospital. And that was the point where I put up that white flag. I surrendered. I had to figure this out. And I went and I made an appointment with a physician and he put me on antidepressants because that's what they do. And then he handed me a business card of a trauma therapist. And I looked at him and I started to laugh. And I said, I tried this 14 years ago and it didn't work. So what makes you think it's going to work this time? And he said, well, you really don't have a choice. And I said, okay. So I went, I made the appointment. I sat in the chair with this woman. And this time it felt different. This time she started to ask me the questions that I had always wanted to hear since I was 17. And because she was asking me those questions, I felt like she was a safe space and that I was able to be vulnerable with her because of it. And I was able to take her back to when I was 17 and everything that I had dealt with back then and what I was currently dealing with. And she listened to me intently. And then she looked me in the face and said, Susan, everything you've gone through since you were 17 is normal because you have PTSD. And I kind of sat back and I was like, wait a minute. I didn't go to war and I'm not in the military. Like, what are you talking about? And she said, no, anyone who goes through any type of trauma can experience PTSD. But what you need to know is it's not something that just goes away. It's something you learn to manage. And that was the moment. That was the moment that I realized I wasn't crazy, I wasn't broken, and that I was going to be able to heal from this. I had so much hope in that moment, and I was so grateful, very grateful to be sitting there and knowing that I can heal from this. And this is the person sitting across from me that was going to be able to guide me in this healing journey of mine.
That's awesome. I'm glad you were able to get to that point. I've got a personal question that I was thinking of while you were talking there. After
Sure.
all this time of going through therapy and being almost forced, you said raising the white flag as your husband's suggestion. Are you at the point now where you can think back and remember all the good things about your dad?
Absolutely.
And actually smile about it?
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. And that is such a freedom. And when you do the work, this is where you get to, where you're able to look back and look past the ugliness and the terrible thing that happened and remember the good times and the memories I had of him and the conversations that we got to have together. And just remember how present of a father he was. I even hear this from people who worked with him. He was very much a person who, if you were having a conversation with him, He was there. He made you feel like you were the most important person in that room. And it didn't matter who he was in front of. That was just who he was innately. And I was just so proud of that. My dad was my hero, and he's my brother's hero. He saved my brother's life that night. And for that, I'm grateful. But, as a dad, he was just an incredible human being. And I'm so grateful that he was my father. I always laugh because he was like the go-between, and he was the voice of reason, because my mom and I did not have a healthy relationship. And so he kept me grounded, and I was grateful for that too.
I've got a couple of questions about your mom, but I'll wait until a little bit later on in the conversation to bring those up. But how did your dad save your brother?
So when my dad was coming out with my brother, he had picked him up from school. So my dad had testified that day in a court case that he was the lead detective on. And the man that the trial was about was out on bail at the time. So it gave him an opportunity to lay in wait, which he did. When my dad picked up my brother from after school care that Halloween night, they were walking to the truck, and my dad put my brother in the truck and then walked around. And as soon as he walked around, he saw what was coming. And he told my brother to duck down in the truck. And that saved my brother's life. He wasn't harmed physically.
Wow. How is he doing today?
He's in his healing journey today. He still deals with a lot of things stemming from trauma. But I am so proud of my brother. Like, I call him my Hercules. It was just his birthday yesterday.
Happy birthday.
We're 10 years and 10 days apart. And, I'm just so proud of him. I call him my Hercules, not just because he's, a very big boy. He's my 6'2", almost 300-pound brother. But because of everything that he's gone through in his life, and he's still here on this planet, I'm so grateful every day that I still have him and that he is on his journey of healing currently, and I'm just so grateful for that too.
Good. That's good. So you have a signature talk titled "Forgiveness versus Forgetting."
Yeah.
So can you explain the difference between those two things in the context of your life, and how you learn to forgive without erasing in your mind what happened?
Oh, sure. So there's this myth about forgiveness, and the myth is that if you forgive someone, you're forgetting what they did. And that's not true. You're never going to forget what happened, and you're never going to forget the person that did it to you or whatever the circumstance was. However, I see forgiveness in a different way. For me personally, I found that I needed to forgive because I watched my mom allow hatred to just engulf her. And I feel like hatred it's the killer of your soul. It really is. It takes life from you. It takes the ability of having joy in your life, pure joy. And I didn't want that for myself. So I looked at it this way. I looked at it as, if I could forgive these men that took my dad, I'm taking my power back. I'm being able to say, you can no longer hurt me anymore, and that I'm going to heal from this, and I'm going to be able to have the life that I deserve. And what you did is no longer going to have a hold over me. And so that's when I talk about it, I talk about taking your power back. And forgiveness is that. You're not forgiving for them. You're forgiving for you. And that's taking your power back.
Oh, that's really powerful. So were those the guys involved? Were they ever caught and convicted?
Yes. It took them 6 days from that night to catch them. Unbeknownst to us, we too were a target, the family. So we had police presence in front of our house and in back of our house. And I even had bodyguards, plainclothes police officers that followed me around and my mom around for 6 days. They finally caught him on the day of my dad's funeral. This was a planned out assassination of my dad, and it was planned out for months. So there was a point where my dad was even investigating his own murder prior to. So it was, yeah. I went from having, like I said, like this normal teenage life to this. And then when they finally caught him, then it was, obviously we had some relief knowing that they were caught. But we didn't know about being targeted until the trials, a few years later.
So that's pretty heavy stuff.
Yeah, I know. My story, I tell people, like, strap yourself in because it's a lot.
Well, I'm glad you're here and smiling today. Obviously, it's taken a lot of work to get to that point, and I'm sure there'll be more work to get to where you need to be, you want to be. But I'm glad today that you're able to smile. Yes. All right, so let's talk about your mother for a second. I understand you had to sever contact with her as a part of your healing journey. So how did you know when it was time to set up that kind of a boundary, and what inner work went into making that choice and finding peace with it?
Well, actually, it was my mother. When I wrote my book, it took me 4.5 years to write my book. And the reason it took me so long was because I had to relive and dive and have memories and do all the things. But when I wrote the book, I wanted to be 100% authentic. And I wanted to be 100% vulnerable, as scary as it was. I needed to be that way. You see, there were people out there that had this like perception of who I was based off of what my mother told them, based off their own perception of how they would have handled being in the same situation that I was in. And I wanted people to see me for who I really am. And so in doing that, I had to tell her story too. And, the one thing that came up for this, and I did not vilify her in my book whatsoever, because here's the thing. People deal with trauma in different ways, and people have different coping mechanisms. She chose alcohol, which exacerbated the abuse. And she comes from generational abuse. And so I touched on that. And my mother did not like that. I had a conversation prior to the book coming out because during the 4.5 years, she asked me about it twice. And the second time she asked me about it, I told her that I was working with an editor at the time. And she said, "An editor?" And I said, "Yeah, Mom, I'm writing a book." And she goes, "Oh, I didn't know it was that serious. You were that serious." And I said, "Yeah, I am that serious because I want to help others." So before the book came out, I figured, you know what? Out of respect for her, I needed her to know what I wrote about. So I sat down and I had a conversation with her. And prior to this, I realized that my mom is a covert narcissist. Okay, so I had to learn very quickly that I needed to have this conversation, but be empathetic towards her because it's going to be a heavy conversation, and also not engage in any gaslighting or any of that sort of behavior. So when I sat down with her, I just, I put out in love. Like I was like, okay, I'm doing this in love. And I sat down and I told her everything. I said, I talk about your drinking. And I talk about generational abuse. And, there are things in this book, Mom, that you're going to read that are going to be very difficult for you. And I'm just here to tell you this is what's in it, And she basically said, there's nothing you could write about in that book that would make me love you less. So let's just leave it that way. And when the book came out, I went and I brought her copy. And I had put in a personal note to her. And she sat it down with her mail and walked away. And I thought, okay, cool. I went home, and about 45 minutes later, I got a call from her, and she said, I read the first 2 chapters of your book. It's very well written. And I said, thank you. And see, she sent me away that night from the school. She sent me with a neighbor instead of keeping me with the family. She was with my brother, but she sent me away to the neighbor's house. So I know what neighbor I went with. And she tried to argue with me about that, like where I went. And I didn't engage, I didn't engage in it. But I felt like walking away from that conversation that it went pretty well. After she read the first 2 chapters, I didn't hear anything from her. And I waited about a week and I called my brother and we were talking about something completely different. And then I said, hey, just out of curiosity, did Mom finish my book? And he said, oh, yes, she did. And I said, really? And he said, yeah. He said, she called me one day and she said, I want you to come with me to the lawyer. And he said, why? And she said, because I want to take your sister out of the will.
Whoa.
So in that moment, she chose to sever our relationship. And I knew that that was going to happen. That could be an outcome after the book. I was prepared. And honestly, I am at peace with that because I realized that there's nothing I could do or say to make that relationship healthy. So I needed to keep my peace, not only for myself, but for my family as well. And I send her love all the time. I have no ill will. She made her choice, and that's okay. That's her journey. It's her life. And, I have my journey, and I'm at peace with her decision.
Wow. So that assassin essentially took both your parents away from you.
Absolutely. My mom lost her identity that night. It's easier for her to be the widow than to be who she really is. And I didn't want to live my life that way. And, I was sad for that because I feel like my mom deserved love and she didn't allow that into her life. And so, but again, that's her journey and it's her life and it's her choices. So
Tough. That's tough.
Yeah.
So how did you transition from being the person who survived to becoming the person who now helps other people find hope?
Writing my book did that. There were, like I said before, part of the reason why I wanted to write the book was to show people who I am as a person. The second reason that I wrote that book is because I realized that there was so much pain and anger around my dad's death. I mean, we're talking 40 years later now. It was just 40 years last week on Halloween. And I realized that there was so much pain and anger still attached to his death that I thought that if the law enforcement world, that community read my book, that somehow, some way, that them seeing my resiliency, seeing the work that I've done and that I'm healing from it, that in some sort of way, they could heal themselves. And then as I zoomed back, I realized that there's other people besides law enforcement that have gone through trauma that need to see. They needed to have the hope that I received. And I felt like that message was so important to not only just law enforcement, but anyone who has gone through anything traumatic in their life, and to let them know that they're not alone, because that's what you feel when you've gone through a trauma, is you feel like you're the only one. You're like lone person on an island. Nobody knows how you feel. But I want people to know that they're not alone. And it doesn't matter what kind of trauma. It really doesn't, because everybody experiences trauma differently. They deal with it differently. And so for me, writing the book, I wanted to put that message out.
So when you're doing speaking engagements, workshops, and keynotes, how do you balance sharing your raw personal truth with providing actionable tools for the audience?
Yeah, well, for me, one of my keynotes is the other side of the gun, and I use it as a journey. It's the same thing I thought about when I wrote the book, is I wanted to hold the hand of the person reading my book and taking them on this journey. And so when I talk to them, it's about taking the journey. It's not about talking, it's less about the actual trauma. It's more about the journey. That's the message. And so it makes me so happy to be able to connect with my audience and see that I'm giving them hope, that they too can heal as well. And so that fills my heart. And that's what I portray when I'm on stage is love and support and hope. It's not as much like a rah, you can do this kind of thing. It's here's the journey. This is what it looks like. And I even incorporate one of the tools that I use, which is box breathing, because part of my speech is about, it's like getting on an airplane, and they make that speech about you have to put your mask on before you help others, right? So I use that context. And I talk about turbulence in your life. So it's an actual journey. And then using the box breathing, it's because the first part of my speech is a little intense, right? And the box breathing brings everybody back down and brings their nervous system back down so that they're not dying in their chairs, right? And so I leave you with the hope. I leave you with knowing that I just gave you one tool that you can utilize when you're feeling out of control, when you feel that turbulence in your life. And that's one of my keynote speaks.
Okay. So what is your dad's legacy?
Oh my gosh. Well, I think a lot of people think of him as the hero because he saved his 6-year-old brother's or his 6-year-old son's life. But I will tell you, in talking to people that knew him, everybody says the same thing, that he was just an amazing human being who was ready to give his shirt off his back. And he loved to take people under his wing and give them support. And so that's his legacy. His funeral was humongous. It was huge. And I've met police officers, well, they're now higher up, but I've met them who worked my dad's funeral. And they say the same thing. The honor. It was such an honor for them to be a part of that. And to, just to know the story and just to have a sense of who he was as a human and as a police officer and as a detective and all of that. So that's his legacy. And that's I say that I am my father's daughter. Like, my dad literally kicked me in the butt to get that book done. This isn't just my message, it's his. And I found my purpose in his death. And when I say that, some people get all kinds of well, how can you say that? But it's true. It's true. I had to go through all of these things and the pain and the healing and the work. But in that, I found my purpose of why I was put on this earth. And that is to take this message and give it to as many people as I can to remind them that, they can heal from whatever it is that they've gone through. And I know that's what my dad would want me. That's the message he would want me to put through is, and that's the legacy. I want to take something that was so ugly and so dark and make something beautiful of it. So that would be my legacy, since my dad's legacy is dark. So
in your healing journey, are there things that cause triggering? Is Halloween, for instance, is that triggering for you?
It used to be for many years. And then when I started to have when I started my family, and I had my first child, I had to shift my mindset around it. It was no longer about me. It was about my child and making sure she had the right experiences. Again, changing that legacy. So yeah, every year for a long, long time, I would look at the clock and it was weird because at the same time every year, I would look at the clock around the time my dad died. Now I look at it as I honor him in that night, and it's no longer sad. It's an honor. And it reminds me now of what I'm doing and why I'm doing it. So it's definitely been a shift in mindset from the beginning to now.
Okay. For listeners who may be in the early stages of dealing with the trauma or feeling stuck in a victim role, what are 3 practical steps that you would suggest to begin moving forward into the survivor or resilient role?
Well, that's a rough question just because it's a very difficult decision for people to make that decision to go get help. For me, I would say if you decide to do that, understand why you're doing it. There's a lot of people I meet where they say, I want to get a heal for my children, my husband, my parents, whatever, right? But you have to heal for yourself. And what happens is as you're healing, the people around you start to heal as well. It's a ripple effect. So if you're going to start that, just know you're not alone. There is someone out there that will help you and guide you through it. You're not going to be on this road alone. It's very, very important, and I talk about this a lot. It is very important for you to understand that if you are going to seek professional help, that you go to someone who understands your type of trauma, because not all trauma is the same. And there are some therapists that want to lump us into one big pool, trauma pool, right? And you can't do that because every trauma is different. Every journey is different and every modality is different. So I always tell people, the first thing you need to do is when you're going to seek a trauma therapist, interview them. You have every right to. This is your journey of healing. It's not theirs. So you want to align with someone who understands your type of trauma. So interview them. Make sure that they understand your type of trauma. Because if they do, they're going to know the modalities to help you. Maybe they've gone through a trauma and they understand exactly what you're dealing with. So interview them. Make sure and understand that the other thing is, if they don't, you're not going to feel safe with them. You're not going to have that trust in them. You're not going to be able to be vulnerable with them. And if you're not vulnerable, that's not doing the work. You have to be able to be vulnerable in order to heal. So that is key right there. That is what is going to take you through your healing journey. But you have to be able to be vulnerable with that person. Your therapist and you have an intimate relationship. Besides a spouse or a partner or anything, you have to be able to know that they're a safe space. So that's the first step.
As a final question today, what's next for you? Do you have any other plans for helping other people deal with trauma, or do you plan to write another book? What's on your agenda for the future?
Well, I definitely have another book in my brain. It's funny because my editor even said that I'm living my next book, and she's right. She's absolutely right. I'm continuing to try to get on as much stages as I can. I have a speaking engagement next September 12th in Gig Harbor, Washington, and I'm going to be talking to homicide survivors. So I'm actually excited for that. And, I try to get out there and speak to as many people as I can and give this message to, even on the daily, just meeting people, having conversations with them and giving them a safe space. People want to be heard. So just even being kind to somebody. I think that's really important. So that's what I tried to do. And I will do a second book, but yeah, my priority right now, I do coach, a trauma resiliency coach. And what that is that after you do the healing, the work with a mental health professional, you get to a point where you feel like you're stuck because you're a different person than when you started out. And sometimes you don't know what to do with that person moving forward. You have goals and plans and things, but because you were unhealed before, you didn't want to move forward, or you had a lot of things get in your way, mindset things get in your way. So that's where I come in, is I kind of meet you where you're at and figure out what your goal is. And then we work to get you there. So I do coaching, and then, but my priority really is to get in front of as many people as I can with this message so that people know that they're not alone and there is hope.
Well, I appreciate that message, and that's a good way to wind up this episode today. So our guest for today's episode has been homicide survivor Susan Snow, the daughter of Thomas Williams. Susan, thank you so much for being here today. I appreciate you being here and sharing your story with us.
Well, thank you so much for having me.
And please go to my website at podcastreallife.com for more information about my guest and the things we discussed today, including a link to her website and how you can get her book. That's it for today's episode of Stories from Real Life. Join us again next time for another chance to learn from each other. Until then, don't forget to shine your light wherever you go.
Thank you for tuning in to this episode of Stories from Real Life. Don't forget to subscribe and share. Let's meet right here every Tuesday and Friday. See you then.